searching for answers.
Here are today's top stories.
It's been over 24 hours.
And the local news.
What we see are a lot of things that are going on the earth.
This is Art of Heaven News Talk.
Broadcasting live from WHPC Studios in Garden City, New York. This is Art of Heaven News Talk, where we deliver global, national, and local news through the lens of faith, comparing these stories to Scripture. I'm your host, Johnny Brummett, and joining me today is pastor and theologian Nathan Gassaway. What's going on, Nathan?
Hey, Johnny. Good to be here with you, buddy.
And Mark Russick of the Russick Outlook YouTube channel.
Yeah. What's going on, guys?
All right, so this is where we cover news from the past week. Every Friday, 3:30 to 4, right here, Art of Heaven News Talk. So, hey, who saw the Super Bowl game on Sunday? That was a great game, right?
Unbelievable.
Yeah, well, I didn't have a dog in that fight, but I did notice that there was some weeping and gnashing of teeth for some and celebration and rejoicing for others.
Hey, it was the highest rated broadcast. I think it was 123 million people saw it.
Oh, wow.
Wow. That's why all those advertisements are $20 million for 30 seconds.
Yeah, no, I think I don't know what the final numbers were, but it was several million per commercial. And depending upon when it would air. And then you have all the different streaming platforms coming in. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of money. And speaking of money, $68 billion were bet on that game.
Yeah.
Wow.
I have a buddy that lost some on that. It wasn't $68 billion, though.
So we can't talk about the Super Bowl without talking about one of the biggest stories this week, the shooting at the Chiefs celebration parade.
Yeah, that was just so unexpected, so sad.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that what should have been really a kind of icing on the cake for Kansas City, a parade that celebrates the win, and then suddenly a shooting and injuring 22 people, many of them children, and fatally, hitting one lady, Lisa Lopez Galvin, and it kind of brings a note of somberness and sobriety to what should have been just a celebration.
And you would think, and honestly, we've seen several parades over the past few years, a time where you're going to bring your children, your family. It's a time of joy and celebration, the various parades. And we've seen a number of these incidents. I know there was one in Milwaukee, there was one in Illinois, and now this. And, it's something's gone awry.
Yeah, and it raises all kinds of questions about gun violence and celebrations, the trauma that people experience collectively, mental health, law enforcement and security. I mean, all these things kind of come to bear on this topic because what should have been a celebration became tragic.
Yep.
Yeah, it's sad, and it kind of hits home because Lisa Lopez was a radio station DJ.
I did hear that, yeah.
Why her? Why her? Out of all the people.
Yeah.
I'm just
and that's a question people will ask whoever's been harmed by things like this. The question is always why, right? Is especially if it hits close to home, and we tend to identify with things that are more like us. So here you are at a radio station, you'll identify a little more strongly, but it does kind of bring it up close rather than it be at a distance. Sometimes, as long as it's at a distance, we're a little numb to it, but. Yeah. I
mean, they're saying that it attracted 1 million people, and then her,
Yep.
It was her. So it's sad. It's sad that there's a shooting to talk about in the news this week, but there's also a second shooting in the news. And this one was at Lakewood Church.
Yep.
The church
Pastor
of
Joel Olsteen, his church in the Houston area.
Gigantic church. 45,000 people attend per week. Can you imagine this? I mean, they bought a stadium and transformed it into a church. And there were, thank God, in between services, there were off-duty police officers to do security there. But apparently this lady brought an assault-style rifle, and she was shot by the police officers, lost her life, her 7-year-old son hit in the head, and It looks like permanent brain damage. The woman probably had mental health issues. I mean, she had a sticker on her rifle that said Palestine. She's got ex-in-laws that were former in-laws that are Jewish. So there's so many threads to the story that could stir up controversy, but it really does make us take a look at square in the face the problems that our country is facing with violence.
Yeah, this church was Joel Osteen's church. So it makes it even more of a crazy story because there's so many directions we can go with this conversation.
Well, I mean, even from there, and I'll take a segue into Washington, and I don't think it was, it didn't line up specifically with this, but in Washington this week, legislation is being brought up, I believe, by Senator Malarkey of Massachusetts, going after the ability to bear guns or maybe a certain grade of guns, trying to eliminate that from the security forces of churches only.
Yeah, so it seems like they're being singled out. Now, this is one of those Second Amendment issues that comes up all the time. But in this case, it seems to me that at least these officers having guns on the premises really probably prevented much more harm.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
So what is the reasoning, Mark?
I just, and I don't know a great deal about the specific bill itself, but just in general statement, I think it's fair. The left, meaning the Democrats, they obviously have been going after the Second Amendment, gun ownership. The government has been pushing more and more towards taking guns away. So I just think as a general policy, little by little, I personally, I don't own a gun, but, I do believe in the Second Amendment.
Yeah, and so it raises questions, though, what kind of process does one go through to obtain a gun? I mean, now here is a woman that some news articles suggested that this was predictable and preventable. Well, predictable in what way? Well, apparently her neighbors have complained. She actually had attended, I think, Joel Osteen's church, some accounts say, and even donated money there. But her neighbors have said that there's something wrong. She has a history of mental illness. Should that have precluded her from getting a gun in the first place? And it seems like people have a point. There should be some kind of a background check. And I'm sure there are things in place for that. But it does raise the question, how predictable was it? I think maybe predictable. And then preventable. Well, if to be forewarned is to be forearmed, and it's maybe a terrible pun in a way. But
you're right.
But it, maybe this was preventable. Maybe she should have never had the gun in there. Certainly, she should have never had the gun. It seems to me.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, these gun laws need to be looked at. Absolutely, this is a great conversation. If you just tuned in, you're listening to Art of Heaven News Talk, 90.3 WHPC. So, I always look at it like this: if the Second Amendment gets taken away completely, is that even possible? What are you going to do if you live in the hills and a bear shows up at your porch?
Yeah, I don't think they're ever going to get there, but I think, that's the end game. The old adage is if you want to get a weapon, you can get it. You can find a way. Where there's a will, there's a way. But I think just kind of slowly chipping away is the strategy from what I can see.
Yeah, and it seems like, people are able to obtain guns no matter what.
Yeah.
And most of the violence is done through illegal firearms. So I don't know that legal firearms restricting that so much is the main thing, although one might question about these, semi-automatic assault rifles or something like that. But really, whether they question or don't question it, our Supreme Court seems to be strengthening this interpretation of the Second Amendment. It's not getting changed very much. In fact, if anything, it seems like what we might call the traditional view of the Second Amendment is being upheld, and so I don't see it changing anytime soon.
So I'm gonna direct a question at you, Pastor Nathan, because a lot of people stereotype religious, Bible thumping gun owners. Now, what does the Bible say though about like loving your enemy and turning the other cheek and all these things?
Yeah, so a person might say, well, you know what, you can defend yourself or something like that. Certainly self-defense is something that many Christians will hold to if your life is endangered or the lives of your family members. Maybe you can defend yourself. On the other hand, you might say that Jesus said those who live by the sword die by the sword, that you don't render evil for evil. Remember, his disciples wanted to call down fire on some of their enemies. He said, you don't know what spirit you're of. So the question becomes, does the Christian have a right to do these things, or is it that the Christian should be more of a pacifist? And this is debated among theologians.
It's a hard call. What do you think, Mark?
I think that ultimately we want responsible people if they choose to decide to have those arms. And, I think depending upon where you live, what the circumstances are, what your motives are, certainly if you feel like you need to have that in an area where you need to protect your family, I understand that. And at the same time, there's people who hunt and use the guns, for food, and that's legitimate as well. So, again, I don't own a gun, but my opinion is I like the Second Amendment. I think that's something that is really, one of the staples of our nation, of our foundation, and I think with good reason.
Yeah, it's a tough one, because if somebody's holding a gun to your mother, what are you going to do? You know, what are you going to do at the end of the day? What would God's will have done? Mm-hmm.
And so some people will say, well, what you do at that moment is pray, which prayer is always on the table. In fact, that's the first thing we probably should be doing. But the question is, can you defend yourself using lethal force? And that's much trickier given the words of Jesus. So it's not as clear cut as you might think, but again, Christian ethicists have debated it. You can make a case for in times of self-defense, yes, but others will say absolutely not.
I'm going to give you a quick story about prayer. This happened maybe 5-6 years ago. I don't know if anybody would remember, but there was a situation where a man came on to the Empire State Building, top of the outside there, with a gun with the intent to shoot. Earlier that day, the woman who was up there, her mother felt an inclination to pray for her. She was in another state. She called her prayer group, women in her prayer group, said, I don't understand, but can you please pray for me? And not knowing what would happen several hours later, the story, as relayed by the woman who was there, said the gunman turned, pointed the gun at her, went to shoot her, and all of a sudden his hand started shaking, and he aimed the gun towards himself, and then just dropped it inexplicably. Some people may say, oh, well, that's coincidence, but these women who got down in that morning prayer firmly believe that God answered their prayers, and that's how the daughter was protected.
It's an amazing story, and ultimately, for the Christian, our warfare is spiritual, and for spiritual warfare, you need spiritual weapons. And prayer is certainly one of those weapons that knows no bounds. It can reach you across the globe. So I think that's certainly one of the weapons, spiritual weapons, that Christians need to avail themselves of.
And it goes to the importance of hearing the voice of God. God says, "My sheep hear my voice." And this woman, I believe, was hearing the voice of the Lord to get down and to pray, and smart enough to call others and to get into agreement with her.
Yeah, praise the Lord.
Wow. Well, this is Art of Heaven News Talk, and I'm gonna hit you with some hard questions. If you want to join the conversation, you can call us at 516-572-7440. So we're talking about this article of the Lakewood church shooting. What about guns in the church? Actually in the church? Because I have a personal story that just happened in the past few months. As I was doing sound, I'm an audio engineer, and I tend to go into worship services and do the tech job, right? And if anyone knows about musicians and audio, musicians on stage, if they go wirelessly, they have a wireless pack on their hip. And I had this experience where a bass player, his signal kept cutting in and out. And I noticed he had it on his left hip, and the rack that it was supposed to connect to wirelessly was to his right. So I recommended that he switch it to his right hip. And that's when he told me he could not do that.
Yeah.
And this was on stage at the church.
Yeah.
So, I walked right into it and then quickly realized, oh, all right, you know what? I'll leave it there. Let's say no more. And it was just interesting. As an audio engineer, I never experienced that before. Very interesting.
Yeah, but I would say, a lot of this is state issues. Do you have the right to? Obviously, you would think he's a licensed gun owner, but there's also certain states where, that's understood, and you're legally allowed to carry that firearm on your hip, your pocket, whatever.
Yeah. We don't know a lot about the guy. Maybe he is in law enforcement now. Actually, most people don't care that law enforcement agents carry things as much as they would just a normal citizen. So the question is, of course, in the Lakewood cases, these were police officers who were off duty but doing private security. They're licensed to have guns. What about the individual? Now, of course, a person might push back and say, hey, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus want weapons or swords in his house? It's a good question. Something that Christians really need to consider, because Jesus in many ways came across as a pacifist, although you can make a case for
I know.
a Jesus. At least he says, with his word and the things he proclaimed, that did bring division among people. It was a kind of sword, as it were, but not for physical violence, I don't think.
Yeah. Right, he at times had a holy, righteous anger.
Interesting. Well, it's interesting conversation, for the record, the church was out of state. It was not in New York.
Yep.
That I had that experience at. So, different states, different regions.
That's right.
Different laws, probably. So, let's go into our next news story of the week here. There was 2 hostages rescued in Gaza.
Yeah.
By the Israeli forces. Can you share about that, Mark?
Yeah, they received some information. They were in Rafah, which is on the east side of Gaza, near the Egyptian border, and they were able, they being the IDF, was able to get in, and they were able to rescue 2 of the hostages. And fortunately, I believe they're in relatively good health. Is the information that's come out of it, but. I think one of the ironies and one of the difficulties as a Christian, we're watching the world condemning, for a large part, condemning Israel for going in there, and there's a lot of pressure to stop this war or to put a pause onto it, and really it's, if you look at the situation objectively, you understand what Israel is trying to do, and your heart bleeds for the innocent victims in Gaza, the people who just want peace, and so many do, and we can understand that. But at the same time, many of them are promoting the removal of Jews. Period. That expression that they're putting out there, from the river to the sea, and that's they're talking about promoting genocide.
Yeah, I mean, and that slogan, and people have tried to water it down, but traditionally that slogan has meant that it's not so much that Jewish people exist in that land, it's that they exist at all. That's really controversial. And that's the understatement of the year. I mean, it's just so it's a horrendous tragedy. 67 Palestinians, including women and children, they died during this. But people are being held unlawfully. They're being held by terrorists. And how do you retrieve them? If it were your 2 children, or your 2 family members, rather, what would you want done? It just underscores that these kinds of conflicts, they're lose-lose situations. God help us to live in peace.
But there's a lot of pushback from them even going to Rafah. A lot of people didn't want them to even go there.
Well, our administration was pushing them not to go to Rafah.
And they wouldn't have gotten these hostages.
Correct.
They did.
Correct.
Didn't.
And and I would say that's part of what Israel is experiencing. Supposedly, some of the arms and the shipments that's coming out of here in the West is being delayed or offset until that they believe they see a change in policy that the West approves of, as opposed to what Israel feels like it needs to do for itself.
It is controversial, the whole Gaza thing. So We do have a call here. Let's see how you doing? You're on Art of Heaven News Talk. What's your name? Where are you from?
Dave from Franklin Square.
How you doing, Dave?
Hey, Dave.
Hi. It's very sad, but it just gives me the feeling that this is all going to escalate, and this is going to be the World War III, because what do you do if people who did the most horrific things since the Holocaust, but at the same time, we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, we're saying it's bad for Russia to invade, or don't do this, or we can't give them planes. This is ridiculous. I mean, this is just, how much money do we give to just Ukraine? Billions. We got poor people. We got so much suffering in the world, but yet we're spending money, time, and energy. What else is this? This is evil forces on our planet who want to do the most destructive, horrible things on both sides. There's just, what is this?
So, Dave, I'm proposing a question. If you were in the office as president today, what would you do?
Well, I hope to run for president maybe and get a Nobel Peace Prize. What would you do? The problem is it's so bad, as well as so many other problems. There's no easy solutions. The problem is, how do you stop people from their hatred and what they're willing to do? And if you have people in power who are ready to do this, if you're a murderer like the guy, the Gilgo Beach guy, okay, he killed 10 or 20, it's horrible. But Putin, Bush killed millions during the Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine. Millions of people are being killed. Or they're being horribly affected for their mental health, their physical health, their structures are being bombed.
I think you said it. How do you get rid of people hating?
Well, Dave, I think that it's going to take more than a president of any country. It's going to take the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That is to say, most of these issues are not merely external things, but they begin with internal things, sin in the heart. And I think that oftentimes, if you don't deal with the root of the problem, you won't be able to deal with the fruit of the problem. And the root of it is really sin and selfishness and just self-centeredness. This is human nature oftentimes. I mean, humans are capable of great good, but also great evil. And so I don't know that in our lifetime, I mean, I'm praying that there will be peace in Jerusalem, around the world, peace on earth, goodwill toward men. But I honestly think until Jesus returns, we may not see that. Now, that doesn't mean we sit on our hands and do nothing. It means that we embody the self-giving, self-sacrificial love that Jesus exhibited in his life and his death on the cross. And we live as examples to the world, I think, because I don't know that there's any government policy that can change the hearts of men.
And I would agree with you wholeheartedly. But also, Jesus said, that these would be the beginnings of birth pains, wars and rumors of wars, kingdom against kingdom. So it shouldn't take us by surprise. And if you're reading the Bible, it's not that it's going to get better until Jesus returns.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at it through a prophetic lens, it seems like we shouldn't be surprised, think it not strange, that these things are happening. So, Mark.
Now, this is an interesting conversation, though, because this week is Lent, right? Mm-hmm. And can you break down what Lent is about and what people commonly do, like fasting?
Yeah, Lent is this time of reflection, of repentance, and looking forward to Easter. But it's 40 days. It begins on Ash Wednesday, this past Wednesday. Yep. And essentially, those 40 days leading up to Easter, people reflect on their lives, their mortality, their sin. They resolve to, through prayer and fasting to follow Jesus more closely. So I think it's a time of introspection. I think it's a time of prayer. I think it's really a time of preparation. We're heading toward the resurrection. And so people often give up things during Lent, except on Sundays. Sundays are considered like mini Easters. So we might call it a time of fasting, but a time of feasting. So we get the feasting part on the Sundays, and certainly when we rejoice, you think that the Kansas City Chiefs fans rejoiced. There's the resurrection of Jesus is a much bigger deal.
So we typically think fasting of food, but we can fast from anything. Is that correct?
Well, I honestly think at its most basic level, fasting is abstaining from food for spiritual purposes. And I think there's a reason for that. I think it does make us depend on God more because it affects our physical bodies more. Plus, it makes us less selfish. It allows more resources for other people. Now, some people do say you can fast other things, maybe. It's not the biblical way, but certainly I think it's good self-discipline to give up things that could be distracting.
And we can look at the example of Jesus, the fasting for 40 days in the desert, and he was well prepared to confront the temptations and the attacks that came against him.
And that's exactly right, because just what Mark said, that those 40 days in the desert, this is what we model Lent after. Jesus, his preparation to face temptation and temptation that he overcame, and ultimately went all the way to the cross and was raised on the third day. So this is leading us up to Resurrection Day.
Yeah, there is something very powerful about fasting.
Absolutely.
And that example of Jesus doing it was amazing part of the scripture. Mm-hmm. So can you give me some examples of your experiences with fasting?
Well, I think fasting is a lot like, here we are in a radio station. Have you ever been in your car and you're trying to get that station to come in, but you can't quite get the right frequency? I think fasting has a way of getting ourselves out of the way, and it helps us to tune into the voice of God just a little bit better. God is able to connect with our hearts because it helps fine-tune the frequency, as it were. So for me, I've seen times of fasting that I could hear God's voice more clearly, and I'm not talking about James Earl Jones' voice booming from heaven. I'm talking about that leading of the heart that we sense, and it's just more clarity and more direction and purpose.
I'll tell you one thing I do real quick, Johnny. When I do fast, it's what I make sure that I do. I have a book out and I will journal because, as you said, you want to get yourself into a position to hear the voice of the Lord. And sometimes, for me anyway, what I'll do is I'll write maybe a question, a comment to the Lord, and if I feel like He's speaking back to me, I get out a red pen, and then that's my way of journaling during that time of fasting.
Man shall not live by bread alone, but every word that is continuously proceeding out of the mouth of God.
Amen.
Fasting, that's my personal experience with fasting. I think so clearly.
Yep.
I literally hear God speaking to me crystal clear. Love fasting. Highly recommended.
And especially if you need to lose a few pounds.
Don't judge.
You've been listening to Art of Heaven News Talk on 90.3 WHPC. This is the voice of Nassau Community College. I'm Gianni Brummett, your host. I'm here with Mark Russick and Nathan Gassaway. You can check us here every Friday, 3:30 to 4, 90.3 WHPC.
See you next week.
See you next week.
God bless.